Hi, this is Shady Atia, professor at Liège University in Belgium, and I'm going to talk today about in-depth interviews. In-depth interviews as part of the qualitative research methods. Well, before starting, I invite you to look at my channel where there are several videos related to the research methodologies, and also I would like to put you in the context that this presentation is part of a series of different presentations on research methods in the qualitative and in the quantitative research domains, and this is a part of a series of videos. Well, what will be the content of the presentation today? I will talk about qualitative research in general and give an overview about it. What are the different types of interviews? What are the major qualitative study design? How to do a questionnaire? How to sample select your sample for the interview? What is the overview qualitative data analysis method with a specific focus on the framework method to make sure if you are looking for a specific interpretation or a way of analyzing your interview results, I will be focusing on the framework method because it's the most famous method and the most commonly used. And finally, I will talk about the rigor and validation and how to validate your work. Well, to start with, as an introduction on in-depth interviews, the goal mainly of in-depth interview is in this presentation is to enhance your capacity to conceptualize, design, and conduct in-depth interviews. And I would like you from this presentation to get out or have a takeaway that how to do it in a professional way. We will look at how to conduct qualitative data analysis for your interviews. We will look at the methodologies of this particular approach, and we will look at some specific tips and recommendations for each step to make sure that you are mastering the in-depth interviews techniques. Well, to start with, how does qualitative research differ from quantitative research? Well, there's a huge difference, but mainly the qualitative research is subjective and is looking to understandings. And it's very important to keep this into account because when we are talking about quantitative research methods, we are looking about generalization that are very objective based on statistical methods or experimental methods or empirical or modeling techniques. However, when it comes to qualitative, we are seeking understanding, so we are seeking depth. And in this sense, by default, qualitative methods are subjective, but what we try to do is to avoid the bias, to make sure that we are rigorous in our approach. And when we look at such a diagram, we can see that there are mainly three approaches in research to approach any research problem. Either we use the quantitative method that looks at generalization, and as I told you, it will be the modeling or the empirical or the experimental approach, or you go for qualitative approaches including several methods like literature review, focus group discussions, usability testing, or in this case of our presentation, in-depth interviews. Definitely there are researchers who take the hard way. They use mixed research methods, simply combining from both fields, but this is very time consuming and it's very difficult. And if you are a young researcher, I always advise you to focus on one methodology and even one single method to make sure that you master it, and maybe later on, if you have a professional career as a scientist or a researcher, you can then use mixed methods. Well, when we look at the difference between both approaches, in the qualitative approach, we are looking at broad hypotheses. We want to understand the whole picture. It's more exploratory, while the quantitative approach is narrow, it's very focused, deep, and it's very conclusive. And these are the two major differences that distinguish them. And in general, the science of how to do research is called the epistemology, and it's important that you have information and attend courses and training on the epistemology of research, which is simply the science of doing research, how to do research. So the flexibility and spontaneity with quality of data and ease of analysis, this is mainly the main characteristic of qualitative research, but it takes huge amount of time. So those are the two major features when it comes to qualitative research, and in particularly in-depth interviews. It takes a lot of time, but you will have flexibility while conducting your work. So what are the common qualitative methods if we are now focusing more on the qualitative side? We can have document reviews, we can have observations, we can have interviews, which is the case in this presentation, focus groups. We can also go elaborate on usability testing, we can go for case study research, we can go for intervention research, ethnographic research, sketching, and so on and so on. Now, how do I know if qualitative research is the right way for my study? This is a very important question that you have to pose in the beginning, and you have to discuss it with your supervisor, because you have to consider the nature of the phenomena that you want to study, and you have to determine what you know about the phenomena to be clear about your goal and make sure that the methodology corresponds in the best way to the type of problem. But at any moment of your work, you have always to respect the following structure. You will have, at any situation, if you select a qualitative or a quantitative method, you must have those 4 phases. You need to go through a data collection phase, a data processing phase, then you come up with something new, your instrument, which can be in this sense an understanding, it can be in this sense a finding, something new that you bring to the scientific community, and finally you have to have an application and a validation for what you are proposing in general. So these are the major steps that, regardless of if you choose a qualitative or a quantitative method, that you have to go through in your work. Now let's talk about in-depth interviews. What are in-depth interviews and what are the aims of in-depth interviews? Well, the aim of in-depth interviews is mainly to get insights, is to have a better whole understanding, and to gain whole perspective. Sometimes we have so complex problems and phenomena that we fail to understand, and specializing in a specific silo way of working, which is most of the time the quantitative research method, you fail to understand and grasp the big picture. And therefore social scientists and humanities are very important to make sure that we are understanding these big and complex phenomena, and we have an overview understanding on the reasons behind it. By default, when we define the interview, we need to have understanding what's the difference between a survey or a questionnaire. In fact, they are the same. A survey is a questionnaire, but we use more commonly the word survey when it comes to the questionnaire. So a questionnaire is the kind of form with the questions. We can call it in English survey or questionnaire. It's preferably to use the word survey. And we can have open-ended questions, or we can have one-to-one questions, but by definition, by definition, in-depth interviews is a very wide method, and we can structure the methods of interviewing under the following 3 structures. We can have the structured interviews, we can have the semi-structured interviews, and we can have the unstructured interviews. And generally, interviews fall into those three broad categories. So you have also to make sure from the beginning what type of interviews you are going to use for your work. Well, if we start to compare them, as you can see, now when I talk about a structured interview, the topic needs to be fixed from the beginning, the question formulation is fixed, the sequence of question is fixed, and the interviewer behavior is fixed. So this is very structured, organized way. The interviews is already prepared. You did your pilot earlier, and now you are using this form or this survey to test it, and you cannot change question or add questions. Well, the most common is not the structured interviews, unless you are doing a lot of short interviews. When you go for more in-depth interviews, people are recommended to use the semi-structured or the unstructured. Why is that? The semi-structured, as you can see, the topic needs to be fixed, but when it comes to the question formulation, there's a mix between freedom and fixed. You can have some questions, but you can add supplementary questions depending on the situation, depending on the answers you get from the interviewee. And the question sequence is also free or fixed, can be different. You can move up in order, you can go to section C before finishing section B, you can move forward or front depending on the situation you are in. And finally, also when it comes to the interview behavior, you are less putting the interview under the pressure to go systematically. The interviewee can be more relaxed in providing their insights and their answer to the questions. When it comes to the unstructured interviews, this is less common, but also it's done in journalism and in social sciences. When you look at fixed topic, but the questions are free, the sequence is free, and the interview behavior is free. So simply you just go to the person and you just have a topic in mind and you start to explore and you meander with the person in the mental, in his brain or in their brain to check what they are thinking about this problem, and you just write your notes and you start to record this and then you come back, try to find what you will do with this information. My recommendation is mainly to use the semi-structured or even the structured. It depends on your ability, but those both ways make it more easier and more systematic when you start your reviews. When you do unstructured, it's closer to journalism, and it can be more vague or broad, which is sometimes needed, but in most times it's not so valuable. Well, when to use in-depth interviews? That's a question that you need to answer. When it comes to individual perspectives and experiences, so we are talking here about people who have a very important position or very interesting positions, and they work in domains that are having a kind of importance from the society or value, and we don't know what is there, and those people are exposed to important situation, conditions, and we need to learn from them. When you are addressing sensitive topics that are not talked about in general, a corruption in a sector, certain bad practices in a domain, it is the only way to talk about is through these kind of in-depth interviews. When you are observing phenomena, concerns about fear or reprisal, when you are looking at behaviors that needs to be changed. So these are all three main elements that will make you think when to use in-depth interviews as a method for your research. Well, now how to design my survey? You need to have some steps to work on before you design your survey. First of all, before designing, you need to have a review on literature in relation to the topic you want to work on, and you have to know where are the gaps, where is the knowledge gap, is it already, what I'm looking at, is it already addressed in literature? Surprisingly, we find in many fields problems that on the professional level everybody talks about, but nobody writes it down. So we are having subcultures. There is a culture of scientific writing and literature and media, but sometimes there are practices and behaviors and things that never talked about. And in this sense, this is an opportunity. When you do a literature review and you do not find that there is a sufficient material and content that address the problem that you have identified, then you start to say there is a gap here, and I think in-depth interviews can cover this gap because I can get a lot of insights and bring them to the surface, and I publish them and make them accessible so that I can better trace and shed the light on this problem. Also, when you speak to your supervisors, this is part of it. You have to speak to them to make sure that they will give you the best advices to design your survey. Also, you need to think about the time you will have, because I told you surveys are time consuming. One of the most time consuming techniques, the in-depth interviews. So make sure that you will have sufficient time, and I don't advise you at all if you have shortage of time and you need to do a thesis or a paper in a short time to use this technique at all. What are your opening or closing question going to be? This is very important because you have to have an idea what will be the essence of my interviews and where they will take me to. And as part of designing your survey, you have to avoid many things. First thing you have to avoid is leading questions where answers are embedded in the question. So you have to revise your language and check with peers or through pilots that your wording and language used is not already giving an indication to the interviewee on what he or she should answer. Also, you have to look at more interpretive questions. So this kind of what you are saying is. So you can inject or insert these questions during the interview process to make sure that you are getting more interpretation and you are validating the understanding of the problem and what is the interviewee is talking to you. Avoid closed questions. Avoid them totally. I am surprised that many researchers they use in-depth interviews and they have questions that they end up with a yes or no. If you have a yes or no questions, don't use interview techniques. You should better go to empirical or quantitative research method where you can make a survey online with several questions and then you do non-parametric or a parametric statistical analysis. But if you have an in-depth interview, it's not about yes or no, it's about why, how, and so on. When it comes also to questions, you have to ask clear questions and don't be ambiguous. Don't ask ambiguous questions that 2 or 3 will each of them interpret them in a different way. The question needs to be clear, concise, and therefore this is an art and a science of writing the questions, and therefore you will need a second hand or you need peer reviewers to check the formulation of your question and use what, how, why, as I told you, and tell me about. This is one of the strongest ways of interviewing people because then you don't guide them. Tell me about. Well, also you can use most important type of questions, so you don't need always to have all questions on the same level of importance. You can group your question into the most important, 5 for example, or 7, and then you have sub-questions that are less important, and then depending on the interview and the time you have, you can start to pose these questions. So this is also an important strategy when you design your survey. And what are the most important problems related to that? This is a common question that you can insert in your presentation. What do you find most satisfying? What do you find most challenging aspect? What do you think the most effective way? These kind of formulations are recommended when you design your survey. Now let's continue. Put yourself in the interviewer's shoes. You must make sure that the interview is sitting in a good place. It's warm or it's fresh. If it's in the summer or it's in a hot place. Make sure that the interview is able to sit. Would you like to be asked those questions also when you are in this situation of the interview? You should look at single page or several page differences. I advise always to keep your questions short, up to 7 questions, maximum in the worst case 15, so that you are making sure that you have a time management, and the interview will talk for each interview, for every question maybe 5 minutes, so then the interview is doable within a range between 45 minutes or 30 minutes up to maximum 2 hours of interview. Avoid academic jargon or confusing terminology. It's very shocking and surprising that young interviewees or young researchers, they use technical abbreviations that they only understand or they use in their community, while the interviewee is not the expert in this domain. So the language, avoid jargon, avoid abbreviation, make it clear, make it simple, keep the language so simple so that anybody understands it, and don't use terms and technical terms that are coming from your community where maybe the others will not understand. So it's very important. And also don't impose word limits. You should leave the speaker talk as much as they want. We are talking here about qualitative method, so subjectivity should be high and the depth should be high, so let the speaker talk as much as they like. Well, there is a technique for creating your survey which is called the laddering question technique, and simply this technique is helping you on how to start now to create a survey and have its content. So the interview resolves around 3 basic questions based on A, B, C. So, or the ACV chain. We call this the ACV chain, which is simply, as you can see, values, how important this is for you. This can be a group of questions that you are creating around the idea of values. Then the second group of question can be related to consequences. What does the difference mean? And the third way is attributes. What's the difference? What is different about these alternatives? So you can start to structure your interview according to values, consequences, and attributes. And as I told you, if you are not experienced in this sense, try to make a first proposition and discuss it with your supervisor, discuss it with a peer, discuss it with a senior researcher, and check that you have created a series of questions that make sense and that are related to this laddering question technique, which is related to values, consequences, and attributes. Otherwise, you can get inspired by literature and see previous interviews and try to formulate them or get inspired from the structuring way. Now, what do you need also when you do your interview? You need to have your recording devices and your memo log. Recording devices today, they can be such simple like your smartphone or external or independent devices, and the most important element here is your memo log. Your memo log, while you are interviewing somebody, you must start writing. Even though you will not be able to write everything, but you need to take notes, because your memo log will be later on checked and can be checked for validation, and others can go get access to it to prove of quality of your work and rigor. So never underestimate the memo log, and the memo log is a fundamental part when you're doing interviews, and you need to make it accessible so that others can read it, and you also have to submit it as part of your work when it comes to your research. Tips for a good interview. First of all, know your interview guide and potential probes well. Rehearse your introduction so that when you start directly, say, this interview is in this context, we are doing this and that and that and that, and then you, in less than 2 minutes, you are able to introduce the interview and then start the first question. Be aware of the power of differentials. People are different, so don't try to force people to go in a certain direction. Put on your qualitative research hat. You should have a hat and think like, I am a qualitative researcher. The outcomes of this work are by default subjective, but I'm avoiding bias. And how to avoid bias? I'm trying to structure and formalize the process and take notes and document. And later on, I will talk about how to validate your process. Speak judiciously. Make sure that you are articulating well. Be comfortable with silence. Leave the silence, because silence can put pressure on the interview and they start to talk. So leave moment for silence and go forward from there. And start now, select your pilot study group. Now, if we have our elements that I talked about here, we have an idea of an interview structure, we have our equipment, we are following these tips and best practices. The first thing you need to do is the pilot. The pilot is simply that you have to choose 5 to 10 people to test your interview. You need to look at size-dependent sample, and you have to look at the diversity of your target group. Try to have a target group that is diverse so that you can expose your survey to different respondents, and then they can give you different different responses to improve your survey. So the pilot group testing is a way to test your survey and expose it to extreme condition. Look for similarly situated people. Look at people who are definitely in the domain or related. Can be students, for example. The group have to have similarity with the targeted group that you want to look at the end. Cover the range of your target group. Look at different age, origin, education, background. It's very surprising if you are seeking to do interviews with seniors while your pilot was done with teenagers. It doesn't work. You have to make sure that there is a kind of consistency. Do your best regarding time and resource limitation, because the pilot study will take time, so you need to plan that ahead and take it into account. And once you are working with your pilot, imitate the real setting of your target group. So start to work on your data, train your data collectors. If you are going to do your interviews yourself, you have to train yourself. If you have a team of supporters or collaborators who are doing the interview with them, it's this time during the pilot study that you have to train them to collect the data and to do interviews. All team members have to use the same method, the same questionnaire. Invite testers one at a time. Observe the tester answering the question, and you can use someone or a camera to check or care about comfort, and ask testers to think loudly so that you can directly get insights and directly modify the questionnaire and understand how is this survey operating in the real context, and solicited additional feedback from experts. Don't hesitate to send the survey to experts and ask them, what do you think about the survey? So this pilot phase is very important in this sense after you have developed an initial structure for your survey. After you are done, you have to start your analysis of your pilot study results. You have to enter the pilot questionnaire answers, and you have to use the data process method that you plan to use. So use the same method that you are planning to use to interpret the results already for the pilot, so that you have an idea what kind of answers, what kind of results I can produce or I will have, so that when you get through this experience, you will validate better your questionnaire and make it more to the point. Also, you have to analyze the results, this will give you an idea for the final results of the study. You have to revise the used language and make sure that people are understanding. This is the moment to make sure of that. Your questions need to be more specific, correct any problematic question, revise, there's difficulty of understanding, there's a confusion, the question is too offensive, it's not well formulated, and if you did significant change, it can be useful to do a second pilot, and if you are low on time, do a small informal pilot just to test it. So it's very important to keep into account that the pilot is the only way to validate your questionnaire, and that's the time that you need to invest in and try to take it slowly to make sure that you will have a good questionnaire or a good survey. Now I will move to the fourth part of the presentation. After I am done with my interview survey, I designed it, I have my topic, I have a structure, and I have an idea what I will ask people. Now, how I'm going to do my sampling. And when I talk about sampling, I mean the people that you will interview. When you will interview people, you need to have a sample. So what is sampling in qualitative studies? When we do qualitative studies in general, not only in-depth interviews, we need to define a population. And when we talk about a population, it is the entire aggregation of cases that meets a specific set of criteria, and it's the eligibility criteria that determines the attributes that will make a target population acceptable for interviews or for investigation. So it's very important here, while you are designing your research method, is to define your population. The second step is start to sample. Since you will be unable to interview all the population that you are targeting, you need to create a sample that can be helpful in representing and providing a depth and breadth of understanding, and the process of selecting a portion of the population to represent the entire population is called sampling, and that's what we mean by the word of sampling. Also, you need to make sure that there is accessible population, so the population of people available for the study. If the people are not accessible, if you are sensing that it will be difficult to access to these people, then from the beginning the study will be blocked, and you need to foresee that all in the beginning, and therefore we say the study or the design of your in-depth interview framework is very important. Also, you have to look at your target population that will represent the overall population, the entire population in which the researchers interested and to which he or she wants to generalize the results. So this is the terms that we need to say. What is your target population? What is your sampling? Is this population accessible or not? How you will make it accessible, and so on. Now, when I explain what is the sampling, now I want to also explain how to do the sampling. So, first of all, when we do in-depth interviews, the good news here is that we use small samples. In-depth interviews are not about representativity, meaning that I can have only 4 or 5 people for my sample. I don't need to have a 300 sample. If I'm doing big samples, then I'm doing most probably an empirical study, which is simply a quantitative study. And in this sense, I can use non-parametric or parametric statistics. But here I am in a qualitative research method that is by default subjective, and I'm seeking understanding and depth. And therefore, my sample size can be very limited. There is no need to have a big sample size. Also, I can use non-random samples. There is no need to have only random samples. So I can use non-random samples. I can target people. And this is also a common misunderstanding. When you do in-depth interview, you can select your people in a non-random way. And you have a purpose to do that. And I will explain that later. You can have a sample design, which is an emergent thing. You can have a specific sample size. You can have, for example, based on informal needs, based on data saturation, meaning that once there is a repetition of the answers that we are receiving from our interviewees, we can stop the sampling. Some people do continuous or emergent sampling so that they keep interviewing people in an emergent way. So they interview people and then they add up, they contact people, they get a network, they contact the person they interviewed, and then they go on and they go on. So they don't define from the beginning a specific limit, they keep it growing. And once they find that the answers that they are receiving are starting to get similar and they are creating an understanding on the phenomena, they stop the sampling process. This is called desaturation, and I will talk about it more into detail. So sampling to the point at which no new information is obtained and redundancy is achieved. That is what is meant by data saturation. Also, you can have evaluating your sampling plans based on the following. You have to look at the adequacy. Is it adequate to interview 15 people? Okay, if the interview takes a time, 1 day, and it needs 7 days to process it, is that adequate or not? You have to look if it's appropriate or not. It depends on the situation and your sampling technique, and using the best informal way for the sample, those who will provide the best information. So the more you are going informal, the more you will get better information. If you are seeking a company head or a CEO, they will be very conservative, they will be aggressive, they will be in the marketing mode because they want to defend their interest, they want to communicate only positives. But when you talk about informal people, meaning people who are away from this position, they are not responsible, the interview will be much productive. And I personally, I went through different interview processes. Once I felt that there is a hierarchy and I will have a lawyer and an administrative next to the person that I'm interviewing, I directly know that this interview is lost, because I will just get non-real talk and just defensive talk and marketing talk. So it's very important to look at the informal part of it. Now, just to give you a very brief information on the types of sampling, just to have an idea, so that when you select a sampling technique for your in-depth interview, you are aware about other techniques and you can defend your reasoning. There is mainly the most common techniques or sampling type that we use for in-depth interview. It's called the non-probability sample. And the non-probability sample are rarely representative of the target. They don't need to be representative at all population, but are convenient and economical. So those are people I know via, I have a contact, whatever. They are accessible. I target those people. They don't need to be representative at all. And I start my interviews with them. And the sample size can be very limited. And I select those people based on my decision of finding that they are relevant to the topic I'm investigating. For sure, under this non-probability sampling, we have the convenience sampling, we have the snowball sampling, and we have the quota sampling, and we have the purposive sampling. In this lecture, I would like to focus mainly on the purposive sampling, which is the most common way to do sampling with in-depth interviews. And for sure, there is other types of sampling compared to the non-probability, which is the probability sampling, which is looking at random sampling, cluster sampling, systematic sampling, and so on. So just to keep it shortly, when it comes to the type of sampling, there is the probability and the non-probability, and for in-depth interviews, it's recommended to use the non-probability sampling with a focus on the purposive sampling. Well, when we talk about non-probability sampling, the convenience sampling is simply accidental sampling. When we have a selection of the most readily available people as participants in the study. When the risk of bias and error as a sample may be atypical for the population, there is weaknesses. It's the weakest form of sampling, so therefore we avoid it. We have also the snowball sampling, which is simply network sampling. We know somebody, we contact somebody, ask the person, can you give us a name of another person? So the selection of the participants by means of referral from earlier participants. And we have also the quota sampling, where we have researcher pre-specifies characteristic of the sample to increase its representativeness, and this is used so sample includes an appropriate number of cases from each spectrum or subpopulation, and usually we are looking at age, gender, ethnicity, socioeconomic status, and medical diagnosis, for example, if it's in the medical context. However, what we are focusing on, and I would like you to focus on, is the purposive sampling. That is a judgmental sampling, and here the researcher selects selects study participants on the basis of personal judgment about which ones will be most representative or productive, and you can do a hand-pick cases very subjectively without needing to justify, because you are not looking to representativity. So let me to summarize this, very important. We are not here in a case of having a representative sample size. The sample size can be very limited, 3, 4, 5 people. We are not looking at representativity. We are selecting by ourselves because we are using a non-random sampling approach, which is called the purposive sampling. Well, you are done with your sampling. What are the major steps for your sampling for your interview? You need to look at key informant, people that will be informative. They give you information related to your topic. You have a goal which is a breadth of understanding. So you want to have a broad understanding of a topic. You don't care about if it's representative or not. You want to understand the problem. You are not caring to prove to anybody that those people I selected, they represent a majority. And many people in social sciences, they misunderstand that. So you have to be strong enough to say, I am not seeking representativity. I'm seeking deep understanding of the problem. Also, the size can vary depending on the complexity of the inquiry. So now, when it comes to the size of sample, I said it can be 3, 4, 5, or whatever. How objectively defend this argument? Well, when we talk about the sample size, we define two major things. The saturation, so the point at which no new concept emerge from the data. So in this sense, therefore I say if it's 3, 4, 5, 6, you can continue your sampling, and then once there is no new data, you stop. So this is a criteria that defines your sample size. So therefore you cannot define beforehand how many people you will interview when you do in-depth interviews. And the second thing is heterogeneity. And when it comes to heterogeneity, I'm talking about statistical means that your population sample or result are different. You just want to make sure that the people that you are questioning, they are providing different insights. And those are the two aspects that we try to identify. And my advice to you, when you are trying to do in-depth interviews and you are recruiting your interviewees, just make sure that if you want to focus on the scientists, the officials, or you are focusing on professionals. Maybe your research is about all three together, but it's better always to focus. Are you focusing on the scientist people or the officials or on professionals, so that you can directly, in a very short way, reach saturation. If you combine many groups of actors, then your sample will keep growing and growing and growing, because the saturation will happen very later in the process, which means that you have to go through at least 30 interviews, which is maybe having a consequences of 3 years of study, because it takes a lot of time, and the heterogeneity will be also very high. So my advice simply is to look at those two factors to make sure to limit your size of sample. And for sure, the context of the interviews need to be well studied. So you need to have information on your interviewee before you start, because based on that, you can describe their background, their context, and this is part of the quality assurance. When you present your results, you say, why did you select this person? What are their background and how they are linked to your information? So presenting the context of the interview or studying it is crucial to make sure that when you select this person as an informant or as a recruited person, you provide a justification for your choices, and then you don't need to have a lot of people. It's just some well-chosen people, and once you reach saturation and a minimum level of heterogeneity, you can stop the process, and then you have your interviews are done, and you start your analysis work. Now, talking analysis, I would like to move to the fifth part of my presentation on the analysis methods. Now, I am done with my interview. I have an idea about my structure. I did my pilot. After doing my pilot, I started the sampling and I identified why and how I will select people until when I will keep my interview. Now it comes to the step where, assuming that you are done with your interviews, you have all your recordings of MP3 or MP4 or whatever medium, you have your memo logs, and you have the material in front of you, and you are done with interviews. What to do? That's here the question. Let's go look at exploring how to analyze the methods. Well, there is two main approaches when we analyze interviews. We have the deductive method when it is when there is a pre-existing theory, or themes or codes are predetermined. So already there is a theory and we are trying to interpret our surveys within the context of this existing theory. Or we are looking at the inductive, which is research question that could bring expected theme, and here we are trying to look at themes and codes that are induced by the data. So actually we have no idea what is the tendency or what are people doing in this area, or how they are behaving, and here we are trying to distill or extract this information, and based on the analysis come up with a theory or understanding. Those are the two common ways when you interpret surveys. For sure, the deductive is more strongly embedded in theory. I prefer the inductive because the deductive is more the other way around. You are listening well, you are trying to understand, and then you come up with a theory instead of doing it the other way around. Have an impact on questionnaire, coding and problematic. Selecting both approaches has a strong impact on your questionnaire and coding and problematic. Because if you are using the deductive method, you're assuming, for example, that all children, they are unable I don't want to use any example, but the deductive way, you are having already a theory and you are formulating your questions within the logic of the theory, and you're just testing through the question the theory. While in the inductive way, you are opening open questions and you are still not having a specific theory. So you don't need to enforce your questionnaire and your way of structuring your questionnaire to check or validate. No, you are totally open and you are trying to get the answers, and from the answers you build up a logic or a theory. Well, when we talk about analysis methods in the in-depth interviews, I advise to use the inductive method. And the inductive method, there are several techniques, mainly the constant comparison method, the framework method, a narrative analysis, conversation analysis, and discourse analysis. And I chose for this presentation the framework method, which is very common and standardized, and it's used a lot in the medical world as much as in the social sciences world. And therefore, I would like to explore what is this method. So the step-by-step guide for the framework method tells us to do the following. First thing we have to do, we have to start the transcription. We have already the recording of our interviews. We start to transcribe them. It can be done with different techniques. Then we do familiarization with the interview. We start to read the interview. Then we start coding, and I will talk specifically what is coding. When we are done with coding, we start to develop an analytical framework. And then we move to step 5. We can apply our analytical framework to our interview, and then we can chart some data into a framework matrix, and then we can have interpretation of our data. Those are the major 7 steps of the framework method. It's very structured, very methodological, and I'm going now slide by slide going to explain each of those 7 steps. When I talk about transcription, I'm talking simply about data entry and storage, and I'm talking about transforming the audio and handwritten data into transcribed type text, so that you should make sure that your text now is becoming a formal document. Why is it important to transcribe qualitative data whenever possible? Because transcription are necessary because notes are likely to bias the data, and depending of the subject, it could be non-verbal cues, the silences and the laughs and so on. So we cannot only rely on the notes or on the memo log. We need to transcribe the data in a formal text that is accessible. So this is the first step. And this is an example for an interview. We conducted a series of interviews, more than 27 experts working on a topic of adaptive facade, and this is how it looks, the transcript after transcribing it from the audio taping. So very formal, the questions and the answers, and we have some context information on the interviewee. Step number 2, familiarization. You need to be familiar with the whole interview and data, which is vital. So you need, at a certain level, when you are done with all the transcription and you have all interviews transcribed, you start to get familiar with the interview and look at what were the questions, what was it about, because most of the time you do it on a long period. So you need to read and reread most of this information, and you had to re-listen sometimes to some of the interview answers, if you have access, if you are having some doubt about something. Third step is coding. What is coding simply is that if you have the transcript and you read it, you went through it, you start to code, meaning that you simply keep a continuity. Coding is simply segmenting. You divide data into meaningful analytical units. You put a meaningful analytical unit. You simply look at keywords that keep your work simplified. So instead of having a text of something around 6,000 or 5,000 words, you start to synthesize it into codes. And these codes correspond to important keywords and topic and concepts and ideas that are discussed in your interview. And simply coding is marking these segments of data with symbols, transcriptive words, or category names, so that you can start later on, start a kind of categorization work. So if I have a text full of codes, I can later on group the codes under categories. And in this way, we are simplifying or kind of extracting the essential information from the long text-based transcript into some codes under certain categories of concepts and ideas. And that's called coding and categorization. So these are the most important steps we need to look at. We say we have several codes, we can give codes on color, we have them under categories, and then we highlight, extract the most important codes and categories. So the coding terminology to use here is that you need to have inductive codes. You have to develop your own codes. You have to see what are these people talking here about. They're talking about maintenance, they're talking about robustness, they're talking about performance, they're talking about sustainability, they're talking about occupant. It is you who has to interpret the the interview transcripts and start to group the topics and create codes and group the codes under categories and make sure that you have a code that bring an understanding of the text, and you can have similar codes and then you start to group them together, fuse them, change the name of your code, and so on. So it's very important to make sure that you are using this coding technique, and I advise you to use a software. There are several softwares that are used in the in-depth interviews where they can help you to do that. Well, this is a software called Atlas, for example. It's a coding software that helps you to code data and help to draw a framework. Simply, this is the manuscript. You can see in the middle, this is the manuscript. The text, you already transcribed it, and you have the file in the primary document side. Now you have in the body the whole interview. You start to highlight some words that you find related to your code, and you start to assign a code. And you have something called the code manager. In the code manager, you have all different codes that you created, and you directly, once you select this topic, for example, and you say this sentence is related to maintenance, the software can make two things in the same time. It can link your code or your highlighted selection to the code, and in the same time, you can also create a code out of it. So that when you say, what are the codes from the text that are related to this code of, for example, maintenance or sustainability, you directly have all the codes of all other interviews. So this is the way of coding your text. Again, you simply insert your files in the software, you define the codes, and every time you mark them, you associate them with the code manager, with the specific code that corresponds to this text, and in the same time you can have a database or a list of codes related to this code. Okay? Well, once this work is done, you can move to step number 4, where you are going to develop a preliminary or an initial framework of understanding. You have a lot of codes, you have categories, now we need a framework, you need a structure that groups these ideas and concepts in a way that makes you or allows you to communicate it to others as a synthesis of the understanding of all what was done. So simply we use the coding and we use our theory that we try to structure the work, and we create a structured vision of the topic insights. That is called a framework. And simply we look at categories. A framework is based on a group of categories, and under each of category there is codes. And the subcategories are serving as important as the main categories. Now, when you develop your analytical framework, you have coded your transcript, you have set the codes to the second transcript, you start to adapt your codes, and now you can choose the right codes, and in case of teamwork, codes from few transcripts independently and meet and agree. You can, if many people are doing this work collectively, you can meet and agree and validate that your codes and categories make sense, and then all coding transcripts can form your analytical framework. So actually, from coding the work, you create a set of codes and categories that will create later on a framework that groups the main concept and ideas related to your work. Now, you will need to index your transcript using existing categories. You can create a framework with quotation. If you can do it manually, but I showed you there is already software, I advise you to use the software I talked about. And this is a snapshot on the final framework of your work. You can see that these are major categories, and under these categories there is codes. So funding desire for financial, and here I can say interview number, and then I can say the preview. Our goal is to increase and then there is a talk of the interview. This is on that, this is on that. So actually the software is helping you with the code and with the categories and with the framework. So just to give you an idea what I'm talking about. My main purpose from an in-depth interview is to produce the following. I want to introduce a framework that structures the major categories of ideas and thoughts that are in this work with subcategories and with codes under them. This is the framework. The second thing I need to produce when I do in-depth interviews, I need to create codes. Quotations. These are extracted text terminology words from the interview. I say quote number 1, interviewee number 18. I think it is mainly because of the cost, because people are afraid of the maintenance of the facades. This is a quote. Another quote. Money is actually key driver to it. So money is the decision-making thing. These are quotes that I extracted. But how can I create that? I have to first start with a code, moving the code under categories, making from the categories a framework, and then associating the codes actually to codes that are important, and then I select the most striking sentences. So simply when we look at the outcome of your result analysis or your interview analysis, you have to come up with a framework of understanding that groups the concepts and ideas and concerns that were elaborated and discussed in the interview under a framework with categories and codes or subcategories. And you need to come up with a series of quotes that highlights the most important sentences that the interviewees were saying or sharing with you. Now, once I'm done with that, I can start the interpretation, and I can start now writing my discussion section and my result section. I need to interpret. I have to go beyond the description of the cases or the reasons of the emergence of the phenomena. I have to identify the area that are not working. It is worth to note that this stage often takes longer than anticipated. I have to create a summary and synthesis, and now I can support my analysis with explicit and grounded argumentation, because I have already created my framework that is coming and this is distilled from the interviews. I have a series of quotes, and with those two components I now can move on and start my interpretation. Okay? Well, don't underestimate it. It takes huge time to do all that, to go through the interview design, select the sampling, start your transcription, start your coding, using the software, learning the software, creating a framework, validating every step. So it takes a lot of time, the in-depth interviews. Well, now let's move to the validation part, and this is the final part of my presentation. Now, during the whole process of doing the interview, developing the questionnaire or the survey, talking to the people, transcribing, there is a series of steps and measures that I need to take to make sure that my work, even though it is subjective, it is not biased. And in order to do that, I need to look at 4 major points: credibility, dependability, confirmability, and transferability. Those are 4 major elements I need to look at. When we do qualitative research, we think about reliability and validity in the same way as quantitative research. When we say we do reliability and validity in the quantitative research methods, modeling or empirical research or experimental, the same applies to qualitative research. So we need to make sure that our work is reliable. We can repeat the experimentation. We can repeat the method we are using. Our work is accessible. We are transparent. And this is all important. So how can we avoid the bias in our qualitative design? Through working on those 4 aspects. And let me explain to you those 4 elements of validity in qualitative research. When I talk about credibility, I'm talking about making sure that this topic, is it worthy or not? Is the problem description relevant to literature or not? Did you connect your problem identification to existing literature or not? Do you have a list of key publications that confirm the importance or the presence of this problem that you are addressing or not? This is a concrete way to answer the question. The sincerity. How are you loyal and sincere and let's say honest in your way of defining the problem? Is there a significant contribution of what you are doing or not? Is your framework that you are presenting, is it something new? Is it really providing something? Did nobody before do it or not? This is all credibility. Were you rigorous in your approach? Did you follow the steps? Did you make a systematic data documentation? Do you save your files? You standardize your approach? Anybody at any time can ask you for access. Is this rigorous approach, or you are just going randomly and you are not structured? Is it truth value? Is it really high value work that you are doing, and that the outcome what you are presenting really represent the truth, and therefore comes the value? So these are all aspects when it comes to credibility. We look at this credibility, and in a way or another, when you are writing your final chapters on the discussion, you need to have a part of the credibility. How did you try as an independent researcher to make sure that your in-depth interviews method was following credible ways to make sure that your work is rigorous and valid? Also, some strategies for credibility. You can have prolonged engagement. You can have field experience that is long and varied enough. So you can make sure that you are involving people with a long field experience or long history. You take people who have a long track record of expertise. So this can be a way. You can make sure that your interview covering those people. You can have rich and thick description, and you make access to all the transcripts as an appendix, or if they are needed. You can look at your structural coherence, your topic list of interview questions, make it in the appendix, or your questions that you posed, even the question that you posed in a semi-structured or non-structured, the new question, you make a list, independent list with them. These are all ways to show that you are credible. You are putting a structure of your questionnaire. Is your interviewing techniques reframing the questions? Did you follow these 4 steps in your work or not? These are all points you can talk about, and if you don't understand any of them, you can don't hesitate to ask to make sure that you have these strategies applied in your work. And also you can look at the reflexivity. Did you keep your memo log? Do you have your memo log? The day you defend your work or you present it, show your memo log. This is a way of credibility. Establish researcher authority. Make sure that when you are talking, you are telling to the interview, I am a researcher, I'm working on this topic, I have this authority. You respected all the ethical issues. You can do member checking. So simply you give your coding technique to another person. Or you can send the transcript to the interviewee to validate the transcription. This is a way of member checking. So these are all techniques. You can have peer examination. You can ask a colleague or an expert in your field and tell him, what do you think about my coding? Can you validate with me my categories that I created? Do you agree with my framing? Do you agree that these are important points? These are all measures of credibility, and this is called peer examination. So you can debrief with other experts in the field Show them your memo log and start to ask them, do you agree with what I did or not? And then you can check and have different opinion from different people on how you interpreted this text and how you coded your interviews. Another important second element of validity is the dependability and consistency. Here we are talking that you make sure that you are having meaningful concurrence. So you have consistency in your work. And is my instrument consistent? Do I use a technique that is consistent, which is mainly my framework? Is it a consistent framework or not that I developed? Does it make sense? Did I test it? Did I show it to other people and they give me feedback before I publish it or before I share it with others? Go consult with your jury or your lecturer or the readers of your thesis and show them your framework before you present it and get their insights. Also, you can look at dependability and consistency by stepwise, well-ordered methodology. Is your methodology well described? Did you describe it well in your methodology section? Did you use a code-recode procedure to make sure that showing how did you do your coding and based on what? And is there transparency there? Did you do peer examination with your coding or not? And that's a bit a repetition, but how was the consensus achieved? If there are different people who agreed with your coding, how did you create your consensus with the coding? The third aspect is conformability. The conformability is that you show as much as possible that you try to stay neutral. The data shaped the findings, or did you shape the findings? This is very important. To make that in a concrete way, you can look at external auditors to make sure that the terminology and the definition of your questionnaire and survey are appropriate. In our research, we tested our questionnaire and we sent it to a linguistic, an expert of language, who made sure that we are using appropriate definition and terminology. You have to check the analysis of your memo log, your notes, you place your notes. Is the analysis making sense or not? How did you do it? Did you cover all interviews or not? Did you highlight the important points of your answer or not? How was the relation between the codes and the framework structure confirmed? Did you link the code to the structure or the framework? Did you test? Did you try to make another interpretation? Is it 100% sure that this framework is really the result of this coding or not? And pair the briefing with experts in the field or outside the field. So again, for conformability, you can do that. The final and the last part is transferability. And here you can ask yourself, is my work applicable in other contexts? Can I transfer my methodology to other type of work? And do my finding apply to other people and time of period? Now I have a finding and I have a framework for this bunch or this group of my sample. Do you think that we can transfer the results to other domains and other fields relatively close to this domain, or this is a very case-specific result that you produced? And in this sense, you can look at transferability strategies like making sure that your nominated sample, was it unique or not? Compare the sample to the population, to the demographic, start to investigate how much is that. And in general, we use something called triangulation. It's very difficult to use the 4 methods that I talked about all to validate the work, but at least you need to do something called triangulation. Triangulation meaning what? That you use at least 3 validation methods from the 4 major elements. Here you can see, for example, a joke that triangulation meaning that you take a confirmation from different domains or from different areas. So triangulation refers to the use of multiple methods or data sources in qualitative research to develop a comprehensive understanding of the phenomena. Triangulation also has been viewed as a qualitative research strategy to test the validity through the convergence of information from different sources. So Denses in 1978 and Patton identified 4 key types of identification: methods of triangulation, investigator triangulation, theory triangulation, and data source triangulation. Meaning that every time, whatever information you develop, you try to test it on 3 different sources to make sure that this information is appropriate. And my advice, in your opinion, in your case, if you are doing in-depth interview, you can do at least a triangulation for validity. 3 things you can do: peer examination. You can use your peers to test your coding, for example, and test your transcripts. You can have testing your memo log and share it and make others read it and show it to others and check with them how they see how you managed to create your framework. You can do also member checking by sending the transcript to the interviewees and ask them to validate the transcription, and maybe they will ask for changes or modification or say you misunderstood this or this is not clear. So these are three example of triangulation. Well, why data triangulation is important? Because then you can widen your view, confirm or challenge the existing stories, enhance our understanding, and move the conversation beyond the technical methods and contribute to the culture of evidence. At the end of the day, even though we are doing a qualitative research method, we are focused here on in-depth interviews, we need to show that we are serious researchers or scientists, even though we are doing qualitative or using qualitative methods, which means that we need to look at the evidence. We are seeking truth, and in this sense, validation is important. Here is a checklist on the validation questions that you can ask yourself. I leave you read it yourself, but it's here very important that at the end of your interview, when you start to finalize your results, or even before finalizing the result, you try to go through these questions to make sure, are these questions answered or not? How is your questionnaire validated? Are the interviews conducted respecting the ethical concerns or not? How was your coding validated? How were the framework structure validated? How did you ensure the sample heterogeneity and the data saturation? How did you justify the representability of your interview's sample? The findings are well structured or not? The proposed framework, is it novel? Does it provide a new understanding or a new perspective? What kind of triangulation technique did you use to validate your research? And these kind of questions should be beforehand in your mind when you start working on the in-depth interviews, so that you make sure that you are on the right path. By now, I would like to end up my presentation with my final recommendation and advices to you to make sure that you will succeed with your in-depth interviews. First of all, in-depth interviews take time and they are difficult to do. You must develop your own interviewing soft skills. Make sure that you have these soft skills to ask people, listen well, leave time and silence in the space so that interviewers talk. Don't take over. Don't get embarrassed when there is a silence in the during interviews. How to contact people is a skill. Being neutral, explaining the interview, telling them the context, giving them an introduction, creating a connection with the people. It's human. You can have a coffee with people. You can sit and share something with them, personal. You will divert. So also it's a way to connect to people. If you are a person who likes this, then in-depth interview is also interesting. Get data out of people. Try to ask them about insights. What is difference? What is not told? It's a very messy process. And we try here with this presentation to make it structured. So try to be organized. Put things in perspective at each step. Look at validation from day one. Validate, talk to your supervisor, talk to your peers. I advise you to select reviewers who are familiar with in-depth interviews so that they don't ask you stupid question. The question of representativity, for example. There is nothing called representativity when you do in-depth interviews. We don't need it, especially when we do purposive sampling, for example. So make sure that you are also sharing your work or making it judged by expert or jury members who are expert in this domain. Seek people in social sciences. They are very specialized in this area when it comes to in-depth interviews, or seek people from medical sciences. They are also specialized in this area. You must know how each step of your work fits with each other. You need to plan the pilot, the sampling, the validation, the framework, how these are matching together, how are you reporting your findings. Leave yourself to reflect on the whole process. Include a discussion section. It's not only about the results, it's not only about the codes and the framework and your codes and the categories. You have also to have a period where you talk, explain, and give some insights. Interviews are subjective, but you must avoid bias through validation. And my final advice for you to make sure to validate, triangulate. Select 3 methods that I explained in the validation and make sure that you do them thoroughly, properly, in a transparent way, and include them in your reflection, include them in your process, and talk about them to make sure that you are rigorous, you are evidence-based, and you are not biased, and you're presenting valuable insights, and that your work can be repeated by others and getting the same results. By now, I would like to thank you for your attention. I would like to invite you to subscribe to the channel if you're interested in future videos. We invested a lot in this series of videos related to qualitative and quantitative research method. Just bear with us, and within the coming period, you'll have more videos related to research method. Thank you very much, and by now, I am sure that you know enough about in-depth interviews, and I know that you will make very good in your work, and you will apply the most that you understood here in your future work. Thank you very much.